We're continuing our look now at Messianic prophecies here in the Pentateuch, and Genesis 49 is our next passage. We've seen the seed promises that give us the promise that the Messiah would come through the seed of woman, and then that's narrowed down in Genesis 9 with the promise that it would be through the line of Shem that special blessing would come. Perhaps a specific promise of the conversion of the Gentiles there, depending on our understanding of some of the wording there in Genesis 9. In Genesis chapter 12, the line is further diminished as we come to the promise to Abraham that through the seed of Abraham and through Abraham all the families of the earth would be blessed. As I think of the book of Genesis, really I would divide the book of Genesis into two parts, chapters 1 through 11 and then chapters 12 through 50, because there with the coming of the promise to Abraham begins a new phase in the history of mankind. Well, we have one other prophecy here in Genesis 49 that also brings us a little bit closer to a family line for the coming of Christ. A little bit out of order, although Genesis 49 is the next passage in terms of our scripture texts. There will be a promise that the Messiah will come through the line of Jacob. We'll see that in just a moment when we get to Numbers chapter 24. But here we have the deathbed prophecy of Jacob. And in the context of this deathbed prophecy, we learn that the Messiah will come through the tribe of Judah. Now in this passage, Jacob is summoning his sons and assembling them. It says to tell you what will happen in the days to come, literally at the end of days, or the latter days. I would caution you that when we see that phraseology in the Bible, both Old and New Testament, the end of days, the latter days, the last days, that we might want to put a context next to that language. The term latter days or the end of days does not always refer to the time of the second coming or the time of the end of the world. In the book of Acts, we have a prophecy from Joel that is said to refer to the latter days, and yet that prophecy saw its fulfillment at the day of Pentecost. Sometimes when people say things like, I think we are in the last days, I cheat a little bit, and maybe I should get a little bit more involved in a debate, but sometimes I've agreed and said, yes, I think we are in the last days. But I will also add sometimes we've been in the last days for some nearly 2,000 years now. Here in Genesis 49, the term end of days simply is referring to a time quite distant from the life of Jacob himself. These are events that are going to occur through the history of Israel, through the history of Jacob's sons. And so these things will happen literally at the end of days. Well, we're not going to go into all of the promises and prophecies relating to the sons of Jacob. Their names that are familiar to us. In verse 3, we read about Reuben. In verse 5, we read about Simeon and Levi. These promises give us words of rebuke. These are sons of Jacob that committed immorality. In the case of Reuben, sexual immorality. In the case of Simeon and Levi, deception and violence. And so not all of these promises to the sons of Jacob are going to be in the rosiest of language. But when we come to Judah, Judah is given preeminence. Now one might suggest this is because the first three sons have lost their ranking, and that may very well be the case. But the promise of a line through whom a ruler would come is found here in connection with the promises to Judah. So let's take a look now. We're in Genesis 49, and we're looking at verse 8. Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons shall bow down to you. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He couches, he lies down as a lion, and as a lion who dares rouse him up. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until Shiloh comes. And to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. He ties his foal to the vine, his donkey's colt to the choice vine. He washes his garments in wine, his robes in the blood of grapes. His eyes are dull from wine, his teeth white from milk. Well, the key promise there is in verse 10. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until Shiloh comes. Now let's just say a word about some of the language here in this passage, and then we'll try to come up with a meaning of this text, how this relates to the Messianic hope we find throughout the Old Testament. First of all, the name Judah itself. Remember, we saw a word play with the name Japheth there in Genesis chapter 9. With Judah, the word Yada, to praise, and the word Judah, Yehudah, are related. And so when it says, Yehudah, Judah, your brothers shall Yada you, shall praise you, we see this literary device. This is not easy to do in English translation, and most of the time it's not even attempted. But Judah will be the recipient of praise from his brothers, and he will be a victor over his enemies. It says that his family will bow down to him. So there's a clear statement here in Genesis 49 that there will come a time when Judah will be the preeminent tribe. The imagery of a lion is quite naturally connected with royalty and with authority and power here. And so this lion, and Jesus himself described later on there in the book of Revelation, he's referred to as the Lion of Judah in Revelation chapter 5. And when the Lion of Judah is introduced, it says that John looked and he saw a lamb that had been slain. It looked as if it had been slain. And so this Judah promise, the Lion of Judah, is something that ultimately is fulfilled through Christ according to the New Testament. Probably the biggest discussion about what is going on here in this prophecy has to do with the interpretation of Shiloh. And in fact, as we'll see here in a minute, not all translations offer us this proper name. So first of all, let's say a couple of things about the word Shiloh and about its interpretation. I would suggest to you that there are a number of possible interpretations or meanings of this word. That's compounded by the problem that it says that this ruler's staff will not depart and the scepter will not depart until Shiloh comes. Let's say a quick word about the word until first, and then we'll look at the meanings of Shiloh. In English, we use until often in the sense of a termination. If we say, stay in the room until I come, the implication is that once I get to you, then you are free to leave the room. On the other hand, until doesn't necessarily mean termination. It can be a more inclusive word. When it says that the scepter will not depart until Shiloh comes, does that mean that once Shiloh comes, the scepter will depart from Judah? I don't think so in this context. This is a more inclusive word. The promise is simply given that the coming of Shiloh, the coming of this one, is a definite established fact, and that through him the blessing to Judah ultimately is going to be fulfilled. Judah is going to be the tribe of rulership, and that will be ultimately realized when Shiloh comes. That doesn't mean there will be a change at that time, but rather it's the duration up to the coming of Shiloh that is emphasized. And so this until Shiloh comes gives us a sense of ultimate fulfillment. Ultimately, Judah will produce the divine ruler. It doesn't mean that that will then cease when the Messiah has come on the scene. So having said that about the word until, the Hebrew word, by the way, is pronounced simply ad, until. Ad, A-D. Well, there's a lot of debate and discussion about the name Shiloh. I'm saying that on several of these early Messianic prophecies that we've looked at in the book of Genesis, and this is one of those. Let me say a word about the rabbinic interpretation, and I've given you a couple of numbers there that we can fill in some answers to. In the rabbinic interpretation of this passage, the rabbis understood this as a Messianic prophecy, but in an unusual way. There was a system of interpretation utilizing various numbers, numerical devices. One of those systems is called gematria. And in gematria, you take the letters that are found in a name or in a phrase, and you add up the numerical value of those letters, and you come up with a number that might have some significance. The Hebrew letter Aleph is the number 1, and the letter Beit has the value of 2. We can go on through the alphabet there. Yod would be 10. And when you start taking words and phrases and counting up the totals, then you get a figure that might be the number of another word. And so what they did with this passage is they determined that the phrase, and one wonders how you can determine how much of a phrase to use there. It gets a little bit subjective and suspect. But if you take the phrase, Shiloh comes, and add up the numerical value for that, you got the number 358. Lo and behold, that was the numerical value for the name Mashiach, or Messiah. And so the rabbis concluded that this phrase, Shiloh comes, was messianic because of gematria, because the number values matched the name Messiah. There is a lot of interest today about numbers in the Bible, symbolic numbers. There have been books written about this, about biblical numerology. It sort of goes next to the whole interest in the Bible code, secret messages in the Bible, if you do computer searches. All of this, I think, leads us in a wrong direction here. We need to look at what the text means, and through our context and through interpretation of other passages in the Bible, come up with a sense of what these words really mean. Well, let's go past the rabbinic interpretation for a moment. Excuse me. Another possible interpretation is that this has some connection with the city or town of Shiloh. This has been argued. I think it has to be rejected for a number of reasons. One, it doesn't really make any sense. Secondly, the spelling is really not the same either. And so any connection with this word, I know it looks like the name Shiloh, which was a place where the tabernacle rested for a while, and the priests functioned there at Shiloh. It was an important religious center in Old Testament Israel, but the place Shiloh and this particular name have nothing in common. Third, some have suggested that this is a type of a personal messianic name. Something meaning something like peaceful or rest bringer, interpreting it as a definite person, but having this special sense or significance. I think this is a difficult interpretation to take here. There's nothing obvious about why the Messiah would be called peaceful or restful or rest bringer. And it's a little bit unusual, and I think there are better answers for us. I'm going to suggest a couple of other possibilities. A recent argument has been made that perhaps the term Shiloh is made up of two words. This will be a fourth interpretation. The first word, Shai, in other words, let's divide up this word, which has 4 letters in it. A Shin, which is the SH sound. A Yod, which gives us the, in Hebrew, Shiloh, or we pronounce it Shiloh, that I or Y sound. The Lamed, which is the L, and then a final letter, which is a He, which gives us a vowel. In this case, gives us the vowel O. So Shiloh, the Jewish Masoretes, the scribes who put in the pronunciation, pronounced it as Shiloh, but that's not necessarily authoritative. It has been suggested that Shiloh, it could be made up of two words, one word being Shi, meaning tribute, and the other word Lo, meaning to him. And so the passage would read something like, the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him. Until tribute comes to him. Now that doesn't quite have the messianic connotation that other interpretations have, but at least it's a possible explanation of this rather difficult phrase or word, Shiloh. I'll come to the fifth interpretation. It's the one that I think is perhaps the best here. And in doing so, I apologize because we now lose the name Shiloh. It is, by the way, the interpretation that the NIV translators have taken. Now here is a question of a translation issue that's rather complicated, because based on how the translator understands a word, that will determine in which direction the translator will go. Sometimes there's a fine line between translation and interpretation. And in fact, it's very difficult to translate the Hebrew Old Testament without having some interpretation of what the words actually mean. Translation and interpretation go together. Sometimes people make a distinction and say, well, let's not interpret it, let's just translate it. Sometimes that's easier said than done. The interpretation and the translation found in the NIV is based on a parallel in the book of Ezekiel. So I want to turn to that right now with you. Ezekiel chapter 21. Ezekiel 21 and verse 27. Now in that passage, this is a prophecy concerning the fall of the king of Judah, Jerusalem. In this case, it's Zedekiah. This is the end of the nation, the destruction of Jerusalem. And there's a promise in the connection with this that says that once the crown is taken off of Zedekiah's head, and verse 26 there in Ezekiel 21 says, remove the turban and take off the crown, and exalt that which is low, and abase that which is high. This is going to be a real difficult and destructive phase for God's people. And the throne, the kingdom, has been at least temporarily here suspended. No longer does the kingdom of Judah exist as an independent nation. And so the throne, the crown is taken off the one who was on the throne. Remove it. And then verse 27, a ruin, a ruin, a ruin, I shall make it. And this will be no more, until he comes whose right it is, and I shall give it to him. Now the Hebrew expression, until he comes whose right it is awfully similar to what we have here in Genesis 49. And so the NIV has translated Genesis 49:10 in the following way. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he comes to whom it belongs, and the obedience of the nations is his. Now that forces us to understand the word Shiloh a little bit differently. It's not a proper name. It's rather a compound of a relative pronoun, which or who or that, which in this case is pronounced something like she, and then the pronoun suffix lo, which means to him. So we have a pronoun, a relative pronoun, a preposition to, and then we have a pronoun suffix his, which is to him, something like that. And so the scepter will not depart until that which belongs to him comes, or until he comes to whom it belongs. That's the way, by the way, the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, understood this passage. until that comes which belongs to him. Also the Vulgate, the Latin Bible, and the Syriac, the Christian Aramaic translation, all of these understood this as a phrase and not as a proper name. Now, as such, by suggesting that the word Shiloh is not a proper name, but rather is an explanatory phrase, does not diminish the messianic focus of the text. So, this is still a promise that the Messiah, the one who has the right to the throne, will come, and that throne will be from the line of Judah. Judah is promised as the kingly line through whom the Messiah will come. And so those are the various interpretations of Shiloh or Shiloh. It seems to me that phraseology is probably the best way to understand it. At the end of that passage, there are a couple of statements that I think speak to the abundance that will be present when the Messiah comes and in the Messianic age, tying his foal to the vine, his donkey's colt to the choice vine. There's no need to worry about the vines being destroyed by that because of the abundance that is there. Garments washed in wine, health, eyes dull from wine or dark from wine, probably is a better translation there. His teeth white from wine, from milk. These are ways of describing the abundance. We might say, eat your carrots so your eyes will be bright. But here it was wine and milk that were viewed as sources of health. And so great abundance and health are being described here, I think, figuratively, as a way of expressing the Messianic age and kingdom. And so the promise to Judah that ultimately through that line the Messiah would come. The Messiah is the seed of woman, the seed of Abraham. He was the seed of Shem there in Genesis 9. And now in Genesis 49 we learn that he is going to be the seed of Judah. The Messiah will come through the line of Judah.